Hi, my name is Tim Bacon, CEO of Medicine in Practice. I'd like to welcome you to this brief lecture outlining why clinical research teams really need to pay close attention to compliance with clinical trial registration and result disclosure. Simply put, they are serious this time. Both FDA and NIH are actively monitoring compliance and are willing to levy significant penalties, including fines of more than $11,000 a day for non-compliance. We can't cover everything in this lecture, so my goal today is to give you a high-level overview of some key features of the FDAAA Final Rule and the new NIH Policy on dissemination of NIH-funded clinical trial information, both finally announced on September 16, 2016. It's also important that we understand that, for the first time, both NIH and FDA have implemented compliance monitoring processes. And where there is monitoring, there are always penalties, which is why this is such a timely topic. Specifically, I'll walk you through some key changes in the new regulations, which studies are impacted, the registration deadlines, and how to navigate the switchover from FDAAA to the final rule. We will also cover mandatory updates to your record, and of course, compliance monitoring and penalties. Finally, we will touch on who else is watching and offer a couple of practical tips to streamline your compliance process. A lot to cover, so we'll move pretty fast. Let's take a look at some key changes impacted by the final rule, and remember that a stated aim of the new regulation is to increase transparency in the clinical research process through a wider scope of disclosure. The effective date for both the final rule and NIH policy was January the 18th, and the compliance deadline was April 18th, both in 2017. If you browse the new regulations, you will immediately notice a much stricter, more legal tone. The more precise text will make any enforcement actions simpler to prosecute. The rule adds some new required data elements, but it also helps to clarify some of the original data elements, making it easier for us to understand what is required. There is also a new and more formalized QA process, with regulated response times by the responsible party, and, as already mentioned, compliance monitoring by both FDA and NIH. So let's start by taking a look at which studies are impacted. Studies regulated under the original statute and the final rule are referred to as applicable clinical trials, or ACTs. The only significant changes to the definition of an ACT under the final rule is that the study start date is on or after January the 18th, 2017, also known as the final rule effective date, and that studies for interventions that are not yet approved or cleared for marketing are also included. The final rule effective date of January 18, 2017 is an important deadline, and we will refer to it several times during this presentation. The NIH effectively coined the acronym FRED, and we will use that in this presentation. The final rule helps clarify several data elements, but perhaps most important is that it includes fields that definitively identify an entry as an ACT. This helps both FDA and NIH in their compliance monitoring activities. The NIH policy specifically covers studies that are funded wholly or in part by NIH and builds on the definition of an ACT to include Phase 1 studies of FDA-regulated interventions and also non-FDA regulated interventions such as behavioral studies, and of course covers both intramural and extramural grants. Correctly identifying an ACT is obviously very important, and the clinicaltrials.gov or CTG team have provided a very helpful checklist to walk you through the process. As soon as you get past the checklist, however, you will be faced with a mass of almost unintelligible legalese, which is closely referenced to current regulations. If, like me, you find this challenging to follow, I would refer you to the Points to Consider section that is included for each question. This presents helpful guidance in plain language. So we know which studies must be registered. Now let's focus on when they must be submitted. For protocol registration, the statute, final rule, and NIH policy all require submission within 21 days of the study start date, which is generally 21 days after the first subject has been enrolled. NIH provides a very specific definition of this, which is a human subject's or their legally authorized representatives' agreement to participate in a clinical trial following completion of the informed consent process. Our general recommendation is that you submit as early as possible, and then update once the actual date is known, and it is important to note that you must update the study start date no later than 30 days after the change. There's a reason for this recommendation, which is that the very influential International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, or ICMJE, require protocol registration at or before the time of first patient enrollment. Note that compliance with this guideline is a condition of publication for any journal that follows the ICMJE guidelines. Currently, that is more than 3,200 journals, including many highly influential ones. For result disclosure, you are required to submit the record no later than 1 year after the primary completion date, which is defined as the date the final subject was examined or received an intervention for the purposes of final collection of data for the primary outcome. If there are multiple primary outcomes, then this refers to the date on which collection is completed for all primary outcomes. There has been some confusion about which regulation you must follow while the final rule is being phased in. Once again, let's bring in Fred to make it simple. For protocol registration, if your study start date is before Fred, then you follow the statute or the original FDAAA regulations. While if it is on or after Fred, then you must comply with the final rule. In passing, you should note that it is quite acceptable for you to complete all the final rule fields, even if you are trying to follow the statute. In fact, we suggest that you consider completing all final rule fields for all studies, as this gets you into the habit of completing the fields. For result disclosure, there is a similar divide, this time driven by the primary completion date. If this date is before Fred, then you follow the statute. Otherwise, follow the final rule. Also note that all studies registered to comply with the NIH policy should follow the final rule. Moving on to updates. This is again an aspect where compliance has been variable in the past, but now is part of the stricter enforcement. It is important that you understand that you must update all records at least annually, and that you must update the date verified field to indicate this. Otherwise, there are several 30-day updates driven by changes to, for example, the responsible party or the study start date. While on this subject, note that NIH have clarified when the obligation to update ends. This is once you have completed all regulated submissions and have provided a complete and full response to any review comments by the CTG team. Okay, so now let's move to the all-important plans for compliance monitoring. FDA will monitor all ACTs and have simply added a new checklist section to their current BIMO monitoring program. NIH, in turn, plan to monitor all NIH-funded studies, both as part of the award process and as part of their ongoing progress reports. Although it is outside the scope of today's conversation, you should be aware that NIH have linked the announcement of their new policy to a much broader overhaul of the NIH funding process for clinical trials. You can find more information on the NIH website. Just to reinforce my point, they are serious this time. Specifically, although the original FDAAA statute included a provision for penalties, none were ever levied, as there was no compliance monitoring in place. That has changed. You can learn more by following this link to the CTSA webinar given in November 2016 by Kathy Hudson of NIH and Rob Califf, then FDA Commissioner. That presentation included one particularly interesting slide that presented data on results reporting for probable ACTs among the CTSAs. I'm sure you're familiar with NIH's CTSA program that includes many of the major US academic medical centers. What is interesting is the broad range of compliance with results reporting, from almost complete compliance to as low as 20%. Obviously, we all have work to do to become and remain compliant, especially with result disclosure. At last, we have arrived at the penalty phase. Let's start with FDA. Remember that PRS now includes fields to help clearly identify an ACT, so it's pretty simple for FDA to identify non-compliant studies. They will first send a notice of non-compliance to the responsible party, who has 30 days to rectify the problem. Failure to remedy the compliance failure may result in civil monetary penalties or fines, currently of $11,383. If the compliance failure remains uncorrected after 30 days, then additional daily fines of $11,383 may be levied. Also be aware that there is the potential for both civil and criminal actions if a responsible party knowingly submits false or inaccurate information, and we refer you to that presentation for additional information. The NIH process for grant-funded studies is also very simple, but has significant financial implications. NIH intends to monitor all grant and progress report forms for compliance certification, and to check this against the clinicaltrials.gov records to confirm compliance. They will verify this prior to releasing any funds, and will take historical compliance into account when considering future grant proposals. There are a couple of very important additional considerations included in the NIH policy. The first is that, even if you are not the responsible party, you are obligated to work with that individual to ensure timely compliance. And finally, if over time an organization is unable to display an adequate compliance with protocol registration and results reporting, there is the possibility that all future funding for clinical trials could be withheld from both the organization and the responsible parties involved. You should also be aware that there is in fact a long and growing list of other groups that are watching. We can only include a small sample in our conversation today. First, a growing number of funders of clinical trials are requiring protocol registration, result data, and full journal publication as a core requirement of their funding. Next, there is a group that you may have heard of, All Trials, out of the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford University, England. This group is actively advocating for full disclosure for all trials and actively monitors trials to confirm result disclosure. A companion activity out of the same centre is the COMPARE initiative, which reviews the prospective protocol registration against the primary journal publication to track outcome switching or selective reporting. Finally, we will touch on what was the most popular article in the BMJ in 2015, The Good Pharma Scorecard by Jennifer Miller and colleagues. This ongoing research program identifies all study data submitted in support of a regulatory filing, and then reviews these for completeness of disclosure through protocol registration, result disclosure, and journal publication. There are others out there who are watching, but hopefully these few will serve to confirm that others are looking closely at how thoroughly you are disclosing your trial information. So finally, some simple yet practical tips to help you comply. Each time that you release a new or updated record into PRS, check your PRS account regularly afterward to monitor for any review comments, and be sure to respond promptly. Next, set reminders. This works especially well for the full annual update, and once you have reviewed and updated your record, it's very important that you remember to reset the date verified field. Finally, this can be a confusing and time-consuming process. We strongly suggest that you create and follow checklists to ensure compliance. Remember, they really are serious this time. If you would like to learn more about compliance with the Final Rule and NIH Policy, and also how to enter your registration information into PRS, please visit our compliancetime.com website, where you can learn about our on-demand video training. Once again, that is compliancetime.com. Thanks so much for your interest, and I hope that you found this lecture useful.